Real people, real road stories. Every episode is inspired by true events.
It was supposed to be an ordinary morning, calm sea, soft sunlight, and the familiar chaos of travelers waiting for the ferry. I was sitting on the edge of the dock in Split, Croatia, watching gulls circle lazily above the water, my backpack at my feet and a half-finished coffee cooling beside me. I'd been traveling alone for weeks. You learn to recognize patterns when you're always on the road. Who's local, who's lost, who's pretending not to be both. And that's probably why I noticed her. She looked like she didn't belong there, and yet like she had nowhere else to be. She was standing by the ticket booth, maybe 25, maybe younger, with hair that looked like it had caught every bit of the morning sun. She wasn't holding a phone, or a bag, or even a ticket. Just a small notebook in her hand. She kept looking toward the sea, as if waiting for something that wasn't on any schedule. When I finally boarded the ferry, a small one heading toward the island of Hvar, I saw her again, still on the dock. She didn't board. She just watched as the rest of us climbed on. The engine started, the ropes pulled in, and she was still standing there, unmoving, until the dock disappeared into the distance. 2 days later, I came back to the same port. Different crowd, different light, but the same bench. And she was there again. This time, she did have a bag. A small brown one and that same notebook. She was talking to an older man who worked at the ticket counter. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the man's expression changed. From polite, to puzzled to something else. When I approached, she smiled at me like we'd already met. "You were on the ferry," she said. Her English was clear, calm. I nodded. "You didn't come with us." "I missed it," she said, almost laughing. "I always miss it." We sat by the water and talked for a while. Her name was Lena. She said she'd grown up somewhere inland, a small town she didn't name, and that she'd come to the coast a few weeks ago to wait for someone. When I asked who, she hesitated. Then she said, "My brother. He works on one of the ferries." Her eyes followed every boat that came in, but none of them seemed to be the right one. When I told her I'd be leaving for Dubrovnik the next morning, she smiled and said, "Maybe I'll see you again." The next morning, I came early to the port. The same gulls. The same vendors selling coffee and bread, but no Lena. The man from the ticket counter was there, though. When I asked him if he'd seen her, he frowned. "The girl with the brown bag," I nodded. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "She hasn't been here for a long time." I blinked. "No, I saw her yesterday. She was talking to you." He shook his head slowly. "You must be mistaken." Then he pointed toward the far end of the dock. "There was a girl like that once, waiting every day. Her brother worked on a ferry that never came back." I felt my stomach twist. "What do you mean?" "Storm. 2 years ago." He paused, eyes softening. "She came every morning for weeks. Then one day, she stopped coming. That evening, I walked along the promenade, the kind of slow coastal dusk that feels endless. The air was warm, the water silver with the reflection of streetlights. Tourists were laughing somewhere behind me, the sound fading in waves. I wasn't thinking about Lena anymore, or at least, that's what I told myself. But when I reached the far end of the pier, I froze. She was there. Same brown bag, same notebook, sitting on the stone edge, her feet almost touching the water. I hesitated, unsure if I should approach. Something in her stillness felt heavier now, as if she were listening to something I couldn't hear. After a while, I walked over. She looked up, surprised, but not startled. Almost like she had been waiting. "You came back," she said softly. "Yeah," I replied. "You too." She smiled, faint, tired. "I always come back. I told you, I'm waiting for him." We talked until the sky turned from pink to deep blue. She told me her brother had worked on a small ferry that crossed the channel between Split and Wies. 2 years ago, during a storm, it went missing. "Everyone says it sank," she whispered, "but I think he's still out there. Sometimes I hear the horn at night. I think he's trying to come back." Her voice was calm, not delusional, more like someone refusing to give up on a heartbeat. I didn't know what to say, so I just listened. At one point, she looked out to the dark horizon and said, "Do you know what's strange? Sometimes I see people waving from the ferries, people I've never met. But they always wave like they know me." Then she laughed quietly. "Maybe I'm starting to look like the one who's lost." We sat there until the last ferry came in. The engine slowed, lights shimmered on the water. And as passengers began to disembark, she stood up. Her eyes searched the crowd, slowly, carefully, like someone scanning a photograph for a familiar face. Then she froze. I followed her gaze, but I didn't see anyone. She whispered, "There he is," and took a step forward. The crowd moved, the noise rose, and then she was gone. 1 second she was beside me. The next, I couldn't see her anymore. I ran toward the dock. But there was no sign of her. Not near the ferry. Not among the passengers, not anywhere. The next morning, I went back. I asked around, the ticket man, the vendors, the guards. No one had seen her. When I described her, the brown bag, the notebook, the old man at the counter just looked down and muttered. "You're not the first to ask." I asked what he meant. He said, "Every summer, someone says they met her. Every year, the same story. Always waiting for her brother, always disappears before dawn." I tried to argue, but he only shrugged. "The sea remembers those it keeps," he said. "And sometimes, it lets them walk for a while." When I returned to the port at sunrise, everything looked the same: calm water, quiet vendors setting up, coffee steam drifting in the air. But the place felt different. It had that strange emptiness you feel after a conversation that never quite ended. I walked toward the bench where Lena had been sitting the night before. Her cup was still there, half full, a small circle of dried salt around the base, and next to it, her notebook. I picked it up. It was damp from the sea air. Its edges curled and pages wrinkled, but still intact. For a long moment, I didn't open it. Part of me didn't want to, but curiosity has its own gravity. Inside were short entries, dates, ferry schedules, times written and crossed out. Some pages had simple sketches of the coastline, waves drawn with heavy pencil lines, and on the bottom of one page, a single word. Soon, the next pages were filled with fragments. Not full sentences, just thoughts, like someone trying to write to stay alive. He said he'd be back when the sky clears. Sometimes I dream I'm the one who left. The sound of the horn means he's close. Then, on the very last page, something different, written in smaller, slower handwriting. "If someone finds this, please tell him I kept waiting." There was no name, just her initial, L. I closed the notebook carefully and sat for a while, watching the first ferry of the morning approach. Its horn echoed over the harbor, long, low, and familiar. For a split second, the sound felt almost like a voice. Not calling out for help, but saying goodbye. And as the waves hit the dock, I realized that maybe she hadn't disappeared at all. Maybe she'd simply finished waiting. Some people leave quietly. Not lost, not taken, just done with holding on. Before I left, I handed the notebook to the man at the ticket counter. He looked at it, his expression unreadable. "You found it," he said softly. I nodded. It was hers. He turned the cover over in his hands, then placed it under the counter. "She always leaves it behind," he said. "Every year, someone brings it back." I wanted to ask more, but he just smiled sadly and said, "Safe travels." That afternoon, I boarded a ferry bound for Dubrovnik. As the boat pulled away from the dock, I looked back at the port, the same one where I'd first seen her. Still bathed in soft, golden light, and in the distance, on the far end of the pier. For just a moment, I thought I saw someone standing there. A girl, with her hair catching the wind, watching the ferries go by. I blinked, and she was gone. The sea stretched endlessly before us. And all I could think was how some journeys never truly end. They just change who keeps telling the story. A year later, I returned to Split. I hadn't planned it. My ferry to Italy had been cancelled because of a storm, and I found myself wandering back to the same harbor where everything began. The air smelled of salt and diesel, and the sound of ropes creaking against the docks filled the quiet morning. It was strange. I'd been to dozens of ports since then, but this one still felt heavier, as if something unfinished lingered in the air. I walked past the ticket booth, the benches, the little cafe that sold burnt espresso and day-old pastries. Everything was the same, everything except the man at the counter. He was gone, replaced by a younger woman with kind eyes. When I asked if she knew about the girl who used to wait by the ferries, her smile faded. "You mean Lena," she said quietly. Then she hesitated. "My uncle told me about her. He used to work here." I nodded. "He told me too." She looked down, fiddling with a pen. People say she used to write her brother's name on the back of every ticket she bought. He never came back, but every summer she'd show up and buy another one. Same destination, same seat. Her voice softened. After he died, she stopped traveling. She just came here to wait. Before I left, I walked to the end of the pier one last time. The same spot where I'd last seen her, where the waves always hit harder against the stone. The tide was low, and in the crevice between two rocks, something caught the sunlight. It was a ferry ticket, faded, fragile. Its ink almost erased. I picked it up carefully. On the back, in faint pencil marks, was a name. Marco. And beneath it, a single line that read, "If you find this, tell him I'm not waiting anymore." The paper was old, as if it had been there through summers and storms alike. I stood there for a long time, watching the water rise and fall, and realized that maybe the sea hadn't taken her, maybe she had simply let go. Of waiting, of grief, of promises that could no longer come back. When I finally boarded my ferry that evening, I found a quiet seat by the window. The lights of the port grew smaller behind me, until they looked like stars floating on the horizon. I reached into my pocket, took out the old ticket, and held it to the glass. The ink shimmered faintly in the reflection, like it still had something left to say. I whispered, "I'll tell him," and as the boat cut through the dark, the sea looked endless, not frightening, not cruel, just infinite. Maybe some stories don't need to be solved. Maybe they just need to be carried, from one traveler to another, like a small folded note, found by the water. Months passed, but I kept thinking about her. Not constantly, just in those quiet moments between places, when the sound of an engine or the smell of sea air brings a memory back to life. It was late spring when I returned to the coast again, this time farther south, in Dubrovnik. Different port, different faces, but the same rhythm of departure and return. The same feeling that every ferry carried someone running to something, and someone else running from it. That evening, as the sun was setting, I sat near the water and watched the ferries drift in one by one, each one carrying its own stories. The last ferry of the day pulled in slowly, its horn echoing over the bay. And as I watched the passengers step off, a mix of locals, tourists, workers, I froze. There, among them, was a girl with sun-colored hair. The same stride, the same brown bag. For a second, I couldn't breathe. She looked around, scanning the port like she was searching for someone. And then, she smiled. It wasn't the kind of smile you give a stranger. It was the kind you give when you finally find what you've been waiting for. Before I could move, she stepped off the dock and disappeared into the crowd. I didn't follow her. I didn't need to. Because in that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. Maybe some people aren't meant to vanish. They're meant to be found, over and over again, in small ways, in familiar faces, in the way the sea sounds when it breathes against the shore. Maybe she wasn't a ghost, or a story, or a mystery. Maybe she was just a reminder that we all wait for something that isn't coming back. And the moment we stop waiting, we begin to live again. When I boarded my own ferry that night, I stood by the railing, watching the port fade into the dark. The water shimmered, and for a second, I thought I saw her reflection beside mine, smiling, notebook in hand, watching the sea as if it were an old friend. The wine carried a faint sound, the echo of a ship's horn, low and long, like a farewell whispered across time. And I knew, finally, she had reached wherever she was meant to go. I turned away from the port and whispered, "Safe travels, Lena." Weeks later, I was in Athens, another port, another early morning ferry. I had almost stopped thinking about Lena, until I opened my backpack to grab my notebook. And something slipped out, a folded ferry ticket. It wasn't mine. I hadn't seen it before. The paper was yellowed from salt and air. And on the back, written in neat, careful handwriting, were 4 words: "Keep waiting for the light." For a long time, I just stared at it. The handwriting looked familiar, not exactly hers, but close enough that my chest tightened. I didn't know how it got there. Maybe I had picked it up by accident. Maybe someone had slipped it in. Or maybe, like all the things we think we lose, it had simply found its way back. That night, as the ferry crossed the Aegean, I stood on the deck, the sea black and endless beneath me. The wind was cold, but I felt calm, that kind of peace that doesn't come from answers, only from acceptance. I took out the ticket and held it against the railing, the moonlight washing over it. Maybe it didn't matter who Lena was anymore. Maybe her story wasn't about disappearance at all, but about presence, about the people who linger quietly in our memories, long after they've left the frame, the ones who teach us how to see the world differently, and how to keep waiting, not for someone, but for a kind of light we only find when we stop searching. When the ferry docked in the early dawn, I left the ticket tucked between the pages of a guidebook in the passenger lounge. Someone else would find it. Maybe they'd smile, maybe they'd wonder. Maybe they'd start watching the sea differently, and in that small, silent act, Lena's story would keep moving, carried by strangers, crossing waters, never really ending, because some stories, like some people, don't vanish when they're gone. They just learn how to travel. A year later, I returned to the Adriatic one final time. Not to chase the past, just to see the sea again. The same horizon, the same salt-heavy air, the same ferries pulling in and out like breathing, but something in me had changed. I wasn't waiting anymore, I was just there. I walked to the far end of the pier, where the water was still and deep, and I sat down with a small paper cup of coffee, the kind Lena always held. The port was quiet, the world just waking up. And for a moment, I thought about how many people must have passed through here, each carrying their own unfinished story. Some left, some stayed, some disappeared, and maybe that was okay. When the morning ferry arrived, its horn echoed over the harbor, long and low, a sound that always feels like both a beginning and an ending. I took the folded ticket from my pocket, the one with the words "Keep waiting for the light," and before boarding, I placed it on the stone ledge of the dock, held down by a small white shell. A boy waiting nearby noticed and asked, "Did you forget your ticket?" I smiled. "No, it's for someone else." He nodded, not understanding, but maybe one day he would. As the ferry pulled away, I watched the port grow smaller. The sun broke through the clouds, turning the water into gold. And I thought of Lena, not as the girl who vanished, but as someone who finally found her way home. Maybe that's what all of us are doing, in our own quiet ways, crossing seas, leaving pieces of ourselves behind, and hoping someone, somewhere, will understand what we meant. The sea shimmered like glass, the world kept moving, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't look back.